This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 698 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I want to remind you about FanDuel Face-Off. FanDuel Face-Off is where you compete in quick, fun games against other real people for real cash. It has all sorts of games that you're familiar with, like Home Run Derby, Wheel of Fortune, puzzle and strategy games, and there's more on the way. Contests are action-packed and last between 2 to 5 minutes, so you can play on your couch, waiting in line, during a commercial break, wherever, and on your schedule. Plus, you can practice for free anytime. Whether it be head-to-head, multiplayer, or larger tournaments, FanDuel Face-Off is something for you. Plus, in most contests, you'll be matched against players of similar skill levels, so you're never totally overmatched, even as a beginner. Face-Off is also tied to your FanDuel account and wallet, so you can easily use your daily fantasy funds or sportsbook winnings in the app. Visit FanDuel.com/faceoff or download the FanDuel Face-Off app in the Apple App Store today to get in the game. Age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See FanDuel.com/faceoff-terms for terms and conditions. Damian Harris was back for New England on Monday night, but in that game, it was the Ramondre Stevenson show. The Patriots hit a negative game script, and Stevenson was playing third downs for New England. So as the pass-catching back, he ended up playing 77% of New England snaps. He had a 29% target share in that contest, and he now has a 15% share on the season. This is a great sign for him to at least maintain pretty good fantasy value, even if he does end up seeing less work on the ground and potentially some goal line work. The two players will likely rotate drives in neutral game scripts, with Stevenson coming in as the pass catcher. In that same game was Justin Fields. I mentioned Fields on last week's 15 Transaction show as someone to target because the Bears offense had been operating differently over the last couple of weeks leading up to week 7. They were throwing the ball a little bit more, and that was allowing for more scrambles. Fields has just run more in general over the last 3 games. He's averaging 11.3 rush attempts per game during this stretch. Across his first 4, the number was 8.5. He's now been a QB1, a top 12 quarterback in 3 consecutive games. He's got a tough one against Dallas this week, but Fields should definitely be rostered, at least for quarterback-needy teams. My stance only got stronger after seeing what happened this past week. Now, speaking of mobile quarterbacks, let's talk about Lamar Jackson. From weeks 1 through 3, Jackson ranked 8th, 1st, and 1st in weekly quarterback scoring. He was averaging over 34 fantasy points per game. Since then, so over weeks 4, 5, 6, and 7, Jackson hasn't given us a single QB1 performance. He's averaging 13.7 points per game. So what happened? Well, the Ravens' offense just isn't playing as well. From weeks 1 to 3, they were averaging 4 offensive touchdowns per game. Over their last 4, that's been under 2. And how the Ravens have scored touchdowns has changed too. I mentioned just last week on this 10 Trends episode how I created a new metric that looks at regression in terms of how teams are scoring touchdowns. It takes a team's overall pass rate, and it tells us what we should expect from a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio standpoint. In other words, if a team is running the ball a lot, but they're throwing for a lot of their touchdowns, that metric would show regression. It would tell you what we should expect. Baltimore was on the extreme within that expected passing touchdown rate metric. They should have been seeing far more of their touchdowns coming via the ground than the air. In weeks 1 through 3, 83% of their touchdowns came from Lamar Jackson's arm. And then the touchdowns that didn't come from his arm, they came from his legs. So the Ravens not only were scoring more, but Jackson was involved in literally every offensive touchdown. Since then, we've seen J.K. Dobbins score a rushing touchdown. Kenyon Drake scored one. Gus Edwards had 2 this past week. Now, I don't think this will maintain to this degree because the Ravens are objectively not this bad offensively, and their schedule isn't that bad moving forward. But this is why we've seen such a shift with Lamar Jackson. Deebo Samuel has run the ball just 1.8 times per game since week 3. From weeks 1 through 3, that number was 5.7. I'm not sure this is going to change that much either because they now have Christian McCaffrey. Last year, Deebo's splits before his big role change, they weren't dramatically different when looking at fantasy points per game. But his front half splits as mostly just a wide receiver also saw him with an unsustainable target share. Meaning going back to that type of role means less production overall, at least from a projection standpoint. And at least compared to how he was performing during the front half of last year. Deebo hasn't really lived up to expectation this year in fantasy football, and I'm not overly optimistic that he will, given the CMC deal. He's certainly not a bad player to have on your roster, but he's given fantasy managers just one performance where he's ranked higher than wide receiver 19 in weekly scoring this season. I've got Travis Etienne as an RB1 in my rest of season rankings now that James Robinson is gone. In week 7, Etienne played about 82% of Jacksonville's snaps when his previous high was a little over 53%. He saw 93% of Jacksonville's running back rushes. On the year, we've had fewer than 20 instances of a running back hitting that high of a running back rush share, and only 10 running backs in total have done it. So if you were patient with Travis Etienne, your patience has paid off. We had a new quarterback under center in Washington, and it looks like that was a good thing for Terry McLaurin. In week 7 against the Packers, McLaurin saw 25% target share. That was his highest target share of the season. He scored 18 PPR points. That was his highest point total of the season. It's almost like getting the ball to your best offensive player can result in production. Taylor Heinicke is probably a better solution for McLaurin than Carson Wentz is. Here's a little Tampa Bay backfield update. Rachaad White had a 44% snap share this past week. He had that little blip against Pittsburgh where it fell to 22%, but White had his highest snap share of the season this past week against Carolina. White's been pretty good this year. He has a 50% success rate. That's better than Leonard Fournette's 45%, which is also still good for the record. Now, I don't think White just takes Fournette's job this year, but he's someone who needs to be rostered everywhere as a potential bye week fill-in, maybe a flex play, but he also has upside as a high-end handcuff. Remember, folks, Leonard Fournette has never played a full NFL season before. This next trend is that Brian Robinson saw 2 targets on Sunday. That might not seem like it's noteworthy, but it actually is the first time that he's seen a target in a game. Robinson still trailed both Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissic in routes run this past week, though. So I wouldn't get my hopes up if I had Robinson. He's very much an early down back in that Washington offense. And with Antonio Gibson playing well, it doesn't seem like we should expect that to change. Austin Eckler's crushing it. He's amazing. He's one of the best players in fantasy football. But it's still absolutely wild that Eckler has 5 rushing touchdowns without a single goal line rush. Sony Michel still leads that team with 2 goal line rushes. Eckler still hasn't seen one. Now, the Chargers rank towards the bottom of the league with just 13 goal line plays run this season, and 9 of those 13 have been passes. But it's still crazy just how good Eckler is in fantasy, despite not even seeing goal line work. There's a quarterback change in Indianapolis. Let's hope it forces Michael Pittman to see a freaking down-the-field target. Pittman has not been that great in fantasy this year, and part of that has to do with how he's being used. After 6 games played for Pittman, he has just 1 target that's traveled 15 or more air yards. None of them, according to PFF's data, has gone over 20 yards. For some perspective, Chris Olave has 19 15-plus air yard targets. He leads the league. Listen to some of the names with more 15-plus air yard targets this year than Michael Pittman. Andy Isabella, Samaje Perine, Dennis Houston, Isaiah Hodgins. You get the idea. I'm not sure the quarterback change is an upgrade given there's going to be more mobility under center for the Colts. But let's be honest, people, it's been absolutely awful with Matt Ryan. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com, join the Patreon, subscribe to the newsletter, all that good stuff. Appreciate you for listening. I will talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.